Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today, our dear friend Deb is away at a conference, so Lisa and I will be manning the podcast. We've decided to talk about stay-at-home dads and the evolving role of the father. As we experiment with reimagining all kinds of roles and gender personae, fathers discover non-traditional positions within the family structure. I've had more and more stay-at-home dads show up in my private practice, Lisa as well. This reflects an interesting and important evolution of how we conceptualize the father, and I would submit, mediates emerging aspects of the father archetype. Father as caregiver and home creator.
Well, of course, this is kind of up for me because, as I think everyone knows at this point, I recently wrote a book on motherhood, and I spent years writing that book and thinking about the psychological experience of being a mother and how did that differ from being a father. I don't address that in the book, but it certainly was something that I gave some thought to. And I have had stay-at-home dads in my practice. And what I thought was really interesting is that my experience of these men was that they were having very similar experiences to the ones I was having as the primary parent. So it didn't seem to me like it was hugely different. I had so many people ask me as the book came out, what about fathers? And what I simply like to say when I'm asked that question is, I can't write that book. I suspect that many of the things that are true for women as they mother, as the primary parent, are also true for fathers who become the primary parent. And yet there may be kind of unique differences that I can't kind of get behind because that's simply not my role.
Well, it seems like there's a number of dimensions that play out. That neuroscience has done some really, really interesting research on the role of changes in the amygdala. Now, this is something that was widely observed in mothers, that as a woman transitioned from the maiden into the mother, archetypally, became pregnant, had a child, it's been well documented that the amygdala changes, it grows, it changes its shape, and becomes much more active post-birth. And I think for a long time, researchers assumed that that was some kind of genetic, interesting phenomenon that occurred. But an Israeli researcher challenged that in the last several years and found a large sample size of gay men who had adopted children in Israel, and they were able to do brain scans before the adoption and then a good amount of time after the adoption. And what they noticed is that whichever partner was the primary caretaker of the infant evidenced the same change in the amygdala that a new mother also experienced. The amygdala grows in size, it fans out into a kind of butterfly shape, and there's a lot more neurologic activity that is active.
That's sort of vigilant.
Exactly. This vigilant attunement to the infant, and all infants by that extension. Mm-hmm. And so she was able to demonstrate that it's not so much genetic as the role that we play. And this goes to another kind of conventional wisdom that many men have said that the most important preparation for having a child was having a dog, which is not meant to be negative in any way, but having a living, dependent being that you care for greatly, needing your attention. I mean, dogs can't care for themselves. So as men spent time learning how to and successfully caring for a pet, that vigilance, that caregiving vigilance, and I imagine, not that I don't know that this research has been done, but I would imagine that that also affects the amygdala in some way, because caregiving does.
Yeah, the way that when you have a pet or a child, you're always kind of tracking, like, where is he? Does he need anything? And it's true. I mean, I have this little parakeet, and I'm always kind of like, okay, where is he? Does he need anything? So now that my kids are gone, I've got that same sort of vigilance about my little bird. But Joseph, it totally makes, I wasn't aware of that research, but it makes so much sense. I remember socially, when my kids were little, we had friends who had two moms, and I was talking to the primary parent, and she was sort of bemoaning the fact that her wife kind of never knew what the kids were doing. The kids would be like, mom, and this wife wouldn't hear them. And we were, kind of having a chuckle about this. And I think she was the one who said, I think it's really about who is the primary parent. I was like, yeah. And then that is exactly what I've seen when I've worked with stay-at-home dads, that the stay-at-home dads are better at kind of just tracking, like, oh, wait a minute, he's going to need lunch in half an hour. And mom, might be very loving and stuff, but just is not kind of carrying that mental load of who needs what when. I do also just want to share, a number of years ago, there was a wonderful little video clip that got passed around on Father's Day. These candid videos of these dads rescuing their kid from certain disaster by,
I saw that.
Yeah, just by, it was just amazing, like catching the baby or jumping in front of the wall before the bike hits the wall, or just, just sort of these heart-stopping moments. And time and again, it was dad who did it. So, I mean, I think even if a dad is not a stay-at-home parent, connected, concerned dads also become vigilant about, is everything okay?
Absolutely. And I think that because in traditional American culture, at least, moms were staying at home, dads were going to work, and this is probably started in the Industrial Revolution, actually, and then it became a kind of expectation that we often associated mom with this kind of vigilant tending, that many of us remember our dads perhaps walking slowly towards us when we fell and cried, or mom might rush to us, or dad would expect us to kind of buck up, kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, where mom might be much more anxiously tending to something. And part of that's because dad's amygdala is not firing with that same intensity of concern. It's more a objective, cooler kind of response. And one could say that children need both of that. They need a lot of immediate, intense tending, and they also need that kind of cooler, come on now, let's pull it together. So it's a wonderful mix of these options of response.
Right, because I think when you have that parent whose amygdala is firing, and I can absolutely raise my hand here, there is an anxiety, you use that word, and there is a kind of anxiety with which you approach your kid then, and your kid feels it. I mean, I know mine do.
Yeah, totally understandably. But so interesting that the body changes in response to the behavior. Now, Jung might have been really interested in this as well, but could have attributed it more to kind of shifts in the archetypal activation, that when one is behaving in a caregiving way, a different aspect of the archetype activates that actually changes thoughts, behaviors, but even the biology.
Yeah.
And Jung was sensing into that, although he didn't have the tools we have now, like MRIs and other sensitive ways of registering changes, but he was kind of intuiting that. So, stay-at-home dads. In 2011, the U.S. Census reported that there were 7 million dads who were regularly a source of care for their children. The Pew Research Center in 2014 identified 2 million self-defined stay-at-home dads. About 23% of them made that as a financial decision or circumstance where mom has a really dynamic career. She's doing really great. She wants to continue to advance it. She's the breadwinner. And dad, as part of the negotiation, dad becomes the primary at-home figure for the kids. About 21% of dads are stay-at-home dads because they're motivated to care for the family more dynamically and presently. And they work as the mom works. And then about 35% of stay-at-home dads are there because of a disability or an illness.
Yes.
Which prevents them from being able to leave the home. And it makes sense. They're in the home and they become a primary caregiver. So there's many different dynamics, but I'm interested in more of the cultural evolution of the image of the father, which is going from primarily a provider of resources who leaves the home, comes home at night, maybe around on the weekends, who doesn't have as much of a role or as much energy, perhaps, in providing direct care. And that's changing. We could speculate that there's many different reasons. It could be that there's greater equity in terms of earnings and opportunities. So women are really able to take a lead in the career development and the financial well-being of the family. But there may be other more psychic shifts going on in the underground. And I'm really interested in the idea of compensation. Much like a dream compensates for the waking life, there's something deep in the collective psyche that is moving energy into the caregiving images that inform fatherhood, because the entire culture needs to experience a change in that capacity.
So a kind of reimagining of father as more connected and more tender and more attuned.
One of the conversations that seems to be happening in the culture around the rise of the feminine is a reassessment and revaluing this process of tending the other versus exclusively competing with the other. So for men to experience this uptick in caregiving children, that has an influence on the culture. Across both sexes, a greater awareness and energy in the tending role, which affects what we think of as a political goodness or even moral goodness. There's huge implications throughout all our various institutions.
And I mean, I think it's coming up at a time when there continues to be many families, at least in American society, where there is no father. So back to this idea about compensation, that, you know, I think the influence of the father has been on the wane for, well, probably since industrialization. And there is a way that, again, in parts of American culture, the role of the father is kind of denigrated. You know, dads on TV are often kind of foolish. And it's, you know, mom who really knows what's going on. So there's a way that the role of the father has been devalued. And sometimes fathers devalue themselves and absent themselves, and absent fathers are a real phenomenon.
Yes.
And then almost in answer to it, there are these dads that are stepping in, many times for practical reasons, like there's a disability or, you know, there's something going on with the earning potential. But they're stepping up and stepping into these caregiving roles.
The absent father is a very complicated, I think, dynamic. A fellow named Warren Farrell wrote a rather marvelous book called The Boy Crisis, where he's digging into these emerging trends where fewer boys are graduating from high school, fewer are going to college. Boys are evidencing an increase of mental health issues. And Farrell, of course, like a lot of researchers, are interested in these changes. And one of the factors among many that he is surmising is that kids who don't have access to their dads seems to correlate with their underfunctioning, both scholastically, and their adaptation to life seems diminished, as well as various kinds of mental health issues. Now, this, of course, does not mean that every child suffers that if they don't have access to a dad, but that it seems statistically significant in that correlation. So one of the messages that Farrell is bringing forward is that dads matter, because part of the outcome of the previous attitude, which dads don't really matter beyond funding the family, is that guys have kind of bought into that. And like one subtle example, which if we listen hard, we can hear it, is that when you leave a child alone with mom, it's called parenting. But often when a child's left alone with dad, they call it babysitting.
Or watching, like he's watching the kids today.
And just that easy turn of phrase gives us a lot of information and gives us a lot of insight into the way fathers perceive their own role or their value to the family, but also how the culture perceives them. Courts have regularly awarded full custody to moms and denied much to fathers who were adequate. By the way, this isn't a dangerous situation, but an equally, valuable sense of both parents. But the courts would just consistently assume that the mother must be the sole provider of care if one has to divvy it up. Yeah. And that fathers really are not necessary,
right? And
for
so
the care of their kids.
This thing that you're talking about then kind of gets instantiated into these legal situations where mom is doing all of the care and dad has to just pay for it.
And I don't think either parent is all that happy with that arrangement, really.
No. I want to just sort of take a swing at something here. I think that having kids in our culture is difficult and taxing, and perhaps more so than ever. And that's true for both people. So I think a lot of women feel frustrated in the role of being the primary caregiver, and they may feel that they can't self-actualize, or they can't, they have to work both shifts. They have to go to work and then they do more work when they get home. And, these things have been documented and studied, and I think they're very real. I think that women, when we feel put upon in a situation like that, can often turn resentment, bitterness, and rage toward the husband, some of which may be well-deserved, but arguably just simply simmering in resentment and bitterness is not the best way to deal with it. But some of it may just be like, hey, look, this is hard. This is hard and we're all going to feel frustrated. But we can turn on the men who are helping us raise these kids, even subtly, even unconsciously, with a kind of demeaning, denigrating, little digs, God, if only he weren't so hopeless kind of thing. And I think this has gone on for centuries, by the way, and is very well established in some cultures where it looks like men have all the power, but women sort of take the power back in this kind of unconscious sideways way by constantly putting the men down subtly. And then we can do this thing, right, where we say, well, obviously you can't do an adequate job of taking care of the kid, so I have to do it all. But really, that just becomes a straitjacket for the woman, because then she's really not going to get any help. So I don't know exactly where I'm going, except to say that I think that what you're picking up, Joseph, about the way that fathers are devalued, it is in the culture. And I think women do it sometimes. And I think I'm also just expressing maybe some compassion for the women who do it, because that woman may be in a hard place herself. So maybe I'm just suggesting a dose of compassion all around.
Undoubtedly. And it's not always ferocious denigration of dads. It's often just very subtle. And men will participate in this as well, that they will buy in to this idea that relative to raising a baby, that they're all just kind of knuckleheads, which of course isn't true. That people learn how to take care of babies because they pay attention to it. People don't just produce a baby and instantly know everything about how to care for it. But dads can be dispossessed in a sense and dismissed and assume, I think wrongly so, that that's okay, or that's the way it should be. So fathers on their own, from within their own spirit, need to discover and claim their capacity to care, to tend. Interestingly, as we said earlier, the caregiving then wakes up something in the body and the brain, and we might even say in the soul, that then gives men access to a certain feeling and attachment to their children, to any number of the things and people that they care for, and that's an essential part of waking up the relationship to the child. So it starts with care, then the body follows, and the spirit as well. So what that means is there's going to be a transitional period, which is true basically for both parents. Anyone that's had a newborn baby, and both parents are taking shifts and trying to get enough sleep, and the incredible tumult of just trying to be well rested enough. But that duty, when it's shared equally by both parents, creates an attachment and a monitoring and an intensity in the father towards their children, which is carried forward throughout the lifespan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If we go back to what you were doing, which is to try to really frame this in terms of Jung's archetypal language, we get into this interesting place where we can say, well, is primary parenthood, or we can think about it as the sort of embodiment of the mother archetype, different in some fundamental way from father as primary parent, or this sort of embodiment of the father archetype in this direct care way? Is there a difference, or are fathers living out the mother archetype? Are they getting in touch with their, is that the energy that's rising? And in a certain sense, this is sort of angels dancing on the head of a pin. But I'd like to offer perhaps a hypothesis based on a single data point. But no one's here to stop me, so I'm just going to do it. I had the good fortune to become friends with a stay-at-home dad when my kids were babies. I mean, I think my first kid was an infant when he and I met, and then our kids are exactly the same age. So we knew each other when we each had one kid, and then we had the second kid, although his role in that second child was very different than my role as I gave birth to that child. Our spouses had very similar jobs, and I didn't see him a lot, but I'd sort of run into him through the years. Our paths would just kind of continually cross, which is always delightful because he's just a terrific person. But it was so interesting to watch him parent, and there was a period of time when our paths were crossing a lot because our kids were all playing chess. So we'd have these hours at these chess tournaments together, and we talk about stuff like this. And I remember him making the comment that he did that thing that we were talking about earlier, where it's like, okay, now the kids need lunch, and he's going to need a nap because if he doesn't get a nap, he's going to crap out. And he was carrying all that and his wife was not. So that same kind of just attentiveness that one feels when one is the primary parent, regardless of sex. But I want to say that I think he was a better parent than I in terms of he was a little bit less emotional. He was a little bit more managerial. He was very good at sort of just lining things up and sticking to a schedule. And I was always kind of sentimental with my kids. And, you know, if we were having fun, it's like, well, let's skip the nap today or that kind of thing. Whereas he was good at sort of providing law and structure, where he was better than I was. Let's say it's not like I was terrible at it, but he was better. And I don't know, is that because that's what fathering looks like as opposed to mothering, where I was probably a little more mushy and tender than he was, you know, not by a huge order of magnitude. He was very loving with his kids, but there was this difference that I noticed.
I think that's well documented. And there is something in the primordial archetype of the male, which is a kind of structuring process that shows up even in mythology, that the sky fathers often are the initial organizers of the heavens, are responsible for structuring the stars and orbits and the dependability of navigation even.
Yeah.
It's often a bit lofty, but it has to do with this cosmic structuring. Well, the mythology of the mothers have to do with what's happening on Earth. It's close. It involves all of the senses. It's intimate. And so that goes to that feeling that the structuring and loving father is just a little more abstracted than the archetypal mother, who's really, really close and physical in the energies. And that, of course, both of those qualities are so essential for the health of the child. Interestingly, again, speaking about Farrell's work, that in the unfortunate circumstances where children are raised exclusively by mothers or exclusively by fathers, there are some statistics, or in some areas, the children actually do better if they are unfortunately left only with a father. And often that has to do with things like structure and discipline and goal setting and executive functions of containment. And the more kids are exposed to that, the more normalized it is. And those things are often positively correlated with going to college, finding a schedule, being self-determining. So again, dads are necessary in the world.
And I want to just lift up, because I can hear our listeners bristling a little bit, because we're leaning into something that sounds like essentialism, and in other words, we're saying, well, yeah, men are more organized and orderly, and certainly and sort of maybe value that more than emotions. And I think what I want to say to that is, is that a stereotype? Yes. Is it probably generally true in our culture? Yes. Are Joseph and I saying that's the way it should be? I don't think we are. I think we're maybe just acknowledging that it is. I think he and I, Joseph, I think I'm speaking for you, we would say that we're curious about whether or not it is that way, because there is some kind of universal patterning rather than it just being a social phenomenon. But I certainly don't really know for sure. So just don't want to lean too hard in these things that look like, honestly, like kind of regressive stereotypes about the way men and women should be. I think we're sort of looking at what is and being curious about it.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's important that there is a great difference between stereotypes and archetypes. Stereotypes are these amalgams of cultural perceptions which are really trapped in circumstance and time and a culture at a particular moment. Archetypes are universal, and all human beings have access to all archetypes. So as you were saying earlier, Might we imagine that the tending and caregiving energy that a man accesses, could we imagine that comes through the mother archetype in his psyche, because all human beings have access to this? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And the structuring, abstract capacity that wakes up in a mom, is that part of the father archetype? Absolutely. Because they're all distributed universally. We use archetypes as a way of creating distinctions, because if we don't name the difference between one thing and another, and we lump them all together, then one, there's a diminishment of consciousness, but we also lose our capacity to refine the thing we're interested in, to bring a kind of nuanced and granular investigation into it. So when we say that everything is equal to everything else, well, then actually nothing matters.
Mm-hmm.
So when we categorize things as Jungians, people will sometimes fantasize that we're setting up a value system of what is more important than the other.
Right.
And that's such a very, very, very important thing for all of us to confront. Things being different does not automatically make one thing better than the other. And when we get confused about that, then we start wanting to attack the differentiation process.
Right. Or you think that if we don't categorize, it means that the world will be a fairer place, when in fact, sometimes categories just exist.
Right, and that's part of the evolution of understanding and awareness and all kinds of things. There's a lot of practical value. I mean, if you can't differentiate between salt and sugar, it's going to make you a menace in the kitchen.
Yeah. Yes.
Which may sound like a silly thing, but it's still in that category.
Mm-hmm.
That knowing how things are different allows you to have a career. You can't be a doctor if you can't differentiate between diseases. You'd be dangerous.
Yeah.
You need to know how one thing is different from another. But as we said, when the differences are then weaponized, then we have a problem. It's not an archetypal problem. It's a cultural problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well said. I want to just take a turn here and talk about what it is like to be a stay-at-home dad, and what might be different for fathers who are the primary parent than the mothers. What is that experience like? And Joseph, I know you've worked with several people who were in that position. I've worked with a couple, and so let's talk about that for a minute.
The stay-at-home dads that I have had in my practice discover that they love parts of it, that it's a really novel experience. Most of them did not have dads that were stay-at-home dads. So there is a kind of wide range of possibilities of how that could look or feel. I guess what I'm reaching for is, because it's a fairly new role in the culture, that men have more latitude to define what that looks like. Unlike other better established roles in a culture where there's a lot of cultural expectations and stereotyping. So right now, fathers often feel really free to innovate and create around what that role could look like. So in that regard, it can be really rewarding for a lot of the dads. Also, most of the dads feel, stay-at-home dads, that there is a certain kind of cultural criticism, because the stereotype of the dad as the breadwinner, if they're at home because mom simply has a bigger career, makes more money, it's pragmatic, they can receive criticism from their fellow dads, from the men in their families, and get a kind of sideways glance from other people. So sometimes it can be a difficult blow to the self-esteem relative to how they're treated.
Yeah, not to mention that, many women find motherhood very lonely. And especially being a stay-at-home mom, that can be hard because there aren't that many stay-at-home moms. Mm-hmm. So, 8 o'clock comes and the other moms are dropping their kids off at daycare and going off to offices. But if you're a stay-at-home mom, you're pushing the stroller around, perhaps, just with the nannies in the neighborhood. But boy, I gotta tell you. So here's I'm going to tell on myself. This was just a sort of a glaringly awful, blinding thing I did with this friend I was mentioning before. I was feeling just, overwhelmed and lonely. And I ran into my friend. There we both were with, double strollers, or one kid in the stroller and one kid, strapped on in a sling or something. And I said, oh my God, Mark, it's just, I just feel so lonely. there are no other moms around. And he just very quietly said, oh, well, you should try being a stay-at-home dad. And it was a real oh my God, what was I thinking? But of course, I had been blind to it because I was so wrapped up in my own suffering. What's it like to be the dad at the playgroup? I mean, women do make that situation better for themselves by communing with other moms. And they take their kids to music classes, or they, have play groups, and some women make very good friends with other moms, with kids the same age. And, that was not open to men in the same way. Even if you're at the playgroup with the moms, you're not let in the same way. You're not welcomed in the same way. There's some odd tensions there, maybe.
Absolutely. I think that stay-at-home dads feel really marginalized in lots of ways. There is an organization that I would direct people to that is athomedad.org. athomedad.org.
And we'll put it in the show notes.
And that organization has set up support groups for at-home dads. Some of them are virtual, and there's instructions on how to set something like that up in your own community. But I think what we're speaking to do is that a kind of suspicion that has landed on men as a sex in general is then extended to men who are at-home dads. So an at-home dad who's at the park speaking to an at-home mom, there's a lot of suspicion. Somebody coming on to me? What's the agenda here? What's this guy up to? Some dads have also been challenged. You're a dad, you've got your kid at a playground, and have told stories of mothers getting in their faces and harassing them, wanting to know or demonstrate proof that it's their child. So this really disturbing hostility and bias against dads and making them suspicious where that is not warranted.
Yeah, so you're lifting up suspicion. I think I was even just back at isolation.
Well, I'm speaking of suspicion as an isolating factor, but yes.
I mean, I think they're worth kind of picking apart, because I think the suspicion is an important one that you're raising, and isolation is often a part of raising children when children are young, because you're just with your kids all the time, and women tend to be better at seeking out each other and know how to do that. And it's very kind of normalized, and it's easy to do because there are many more moms who are staying at home, that even though there may not be that many in some places, there are many more moms than there are dads staying home. Just the isolation, like you can go whole days, you can go hours and hours every day without talking to another adult. And that's really tough. And the sense that you don't know anyone else who's doing what you're doing. And how challenging that can be, whatever it is, which I think takes us, by the way, into a discussion about individuation.
So say more about that. What's on your mind?
Well, one of the ways to understand individuation is that we forge our own path, and we don't necessarily follow the cultural scripts, but we take our own counsel, we learn our own values, and where something really matters to us, we do it even if other people are going to give us the side eye while we do it. I don't think that's the only sense in which Jung spoke of individuation, but it is an aspect of it. So if you're a man and you have looked inside your soul and realized that what matters most to you is to be home with your kids and your family can swing it, that is a beautiful thing. And being able to follow that heartfelt, deep desire requires the ability to separate out from collective expectations and, become what Jung said, become an individual. And even if it's thrust upon you because of circumstances, but you embrace it wholeheartedly and you welcome it as your destiny, having to be a little bit off the beaten path requires us to come to terms with, where are my values and where do they differ from the collective values? And being able to stand apart and say, well, yeah, I'm not getting the kind of cultural validation that you get when you do the expected thing. And this matters.
That's beautifully said. And anytime we step outside cultural drift, it takes more energy. And we have to suffer more anxiety because we're charting our path, which is all the more challenging without adequate support. We can find substantial energy through being in service to that unique center inside us, the self. By claiming our fate, we develop the ability to look at it as something to love, accept, and revel in. We discover amor fati. If a man looks inside and discovers that tending his children is the highest priority, it is his true path. It sets him right when he claims it. And of course, this is not the correct choice for every man. We're not all the same person. Some are called to tend a career, tend a religious vocation, tend the community, but the same inner orientation sets things in right order, inside and out.
And before we move on and leave this experience of the individual stay-at-home dad, I do want to bring up the potential for resentment. I think that women can resent the husband who's staying at home. I think that whether it's inherent or purely cultural, I'm not going to weigh in on that, but I think many women do feel deeply conflicted about not staying at not being the primary parent, let's say. That tends to be a more conflicted thing for women than for men. And so, when she comes home from her big job and he says, guess what? He said a new word today. That may land really hard with the woman, and she may find herself feeling resentful that it's not her who's there at home with the kid, even if she chose it. But especially if it's the case because maybe, she was making more money than he was, there may be some very ugly feelings there. And I'll tell you something, men might resent being stay-at-home parents regardless of the circumstances, because it is hard to be a stay-at-home parent. And you do often feel like your work is devalued. You do often feel as though you're doing menial, thankless work. And of course, there's the fear that can come along with being outside of the workforce for some number of years. I mean, women have faced this for years. If I do this, if I step away from work, can I get back? How will I get back? What will I lose? I mean, the effect that this has on women's earning potential over the course of their life is pretty well documented. The fact, stepping away, and, men who do it are likely to face the same consequences, I would imagine. So there's real costs, and there can be some beautiful feelings, and there can be some really ugly feelings too.
It makes perfect sense that there would be shadow and light in everything that we do, everything that we're called to, but rightly so, that the sacrifice, the amount of containment that's required to raise a child is extraordinary, just extraordinary on all the caregivers, regardless of how they kind of got there. So all caregivers certainly deserve our support, deserve the resources that they need, the help that they need. And I think what we're saying relative to stay-at-home dads is respect.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That seems like a good place to end it. And to switch to a dream.
Did you know your dreams reveal the wisdom of your guiding self? Dreams connect us to the secret world within and remind us that we're never alone. We're always accompanied by our inner companion who offers healing, balance, insight, and guidance as we make key decisions. At 28, Charles felt lost and isolated. He had a dream that touched him deeply. As he worked with the dream in dream school, he understood that it was showing him how he was profoundly connected to life. This powerful insight led him to make real progress with his goals. During Dream School's 12-month transformational program, you'll learn to harness the power of your unconscious wisdom, decode the language of metaphor and symbol, discover mythological motifs that shape your life, reveal unknown facets of your personality, unlock the door to inner wisdom. To enroll, just go to interpretmydream.net and sign up today to gain immediate access to the first 3 Dream School modules. Your best life awaits you at Dream School, and we can't wait to see you there.
Okay, so today's dreamer is a woman who's 30 years old, and she teaches English literature and language. And here's the dream. I am in New York with my sister. We are in the reception of a hotel, and it is cavernous with walls and arches made from rich brown marble. The light is golden. We are taken to a room, and we are jet-lagged and tired. This feels okay. We didn't have anything planned in our itinerary anyway. Our room is big, but we go into the small bedroom and get into the bed, one of us at each end. Later, I go to a Victoria's Secret in a mall. All the clothes are really expensive. The sale rack is not really reduced, and I find it annoying. Other people don't seem to mind, and they are clamoring for the clothes. I return to the hotel room and find that I have accidentally stolen some underwear. I have no idea how it got into my bag. My dad has arrived with some of my friends and my sister. The bedroom feels really cramped. Everyone seems to be in New York. I'm embarrassed about the stealing, and everyone tells me I have to take it all back. I don't know how to do this surreptitiously without getting into trouble. And here's the context that she provides. She says, I'm approaching my first wedding anniversary with my husband, and our relationship is in a really good place. My parents' marriage, on the other hand, feels very rocky at the moment. My mom overshared some of the details of the issues they are having to my sister and I when we were on holiday in the summer, and it was deeply upsetting. I am particularly worried about my dad, who doesn't know that my mom disclosed some of this information. Information, I believe, that should have been kept private. Nevertheless, it is clear that he is really struggling. He told me recently that he feels distressed and should be able to deal with things. And she says the feelings that in the beginning she felt calm, safe, inspired, and self-assured, then frustration, embarrassment, and nervousness. She says, for some associations, I'm from the UK, and my sister and I are visiting New York in February, and the city has featured repeatedly in my dreams both before and after booking this trip. I associate it with adventure, excitement, and also some kind of historical significance. I have never shopped in Victoria's Secret, but I think the image of underwear could represent the kind of private information I have received in about my parents' marriage, which isn't mine to bear. So she's done a little interpreting for us already.
Mm-hmm. So from her associations and even the images in the beginning of the dream, New York has taken on a really kind of exalted, magical, perhaps even overly positive quality. Golden lights, cavernous reception rooms, all of this new possibility. And one of the new possibilities that she explores is going into Victoria's Secret. She's looking for a bargain. Costs more than she is comfortable spending. And then the unconscious nips some underwear. What is Victoria's Secret, and what is underwear from Victoria's Secret on a symbolic level?
Right. So if we just kind of start from the beginning, I think I've always assumed that the name was taken from Victoria, as in Queen Victoria, as in the sense of this kind of refined but repressed sensibility of the Victorian era. I have no idea if that's true or not, by the way. I've just
It's a great story, though.
I've always sort of assumed it. Maybe we should check that before I go spouting it. But, it looks, for sort of feminine, but kind of buttoned up, but there's a secret. So there's a shadow side to that propriety that is, fun and a little naughty and a little spicy. And of course, I don't know that it so much has that reputation now, but I think when it kind of got big, it had this reputation of almost being like, like lingerie that you would buy on your wedding night or something, not your everyday underwear, but sort of, titillating stuff.
I was just kind of Googling around, and that story about Victoria's Secret is correct.
Oh, hooray.
You nailed it. It's absolutely right.
Okay. Thank God.
Yeah, this is not something I've tracked in terms of the genesis of the brand.
This hasn't been of critical importance to you throughout your adulthood, Joseph?
Clearly not. But I don't know anything about the history of Victoria's Secret, but from the bit I'm glancing at right now, your story about Queen Victoria is absolutely right. But it looks like this fellow, Roy Raymond, who started the company in 1977, had this experience of shopping for lingerie in a department store for his wife, and found it extremely uncomfortable that he felt like the sales folks were holding him in some kind of strange suspicion. And then the kinds of stuff he saw on the racks, and this is a quote, "When I tried to buy lingerie for my wife, I was faced with racks of terry cloth robes and ugly floral print nylon nightgowns," which, by the way, I remember my grandmother wearing in the 70s and 60s. And there was something just so awkward about the whole thing. And out of that, he had this idea that lingerie could, one, be very beautiful and sexy, and that the whole experience of buying it could be something that's pleasurable and positive. And, for a long time, he was really onto something. I think more recently, Victoria's Secret has gotten into a bit of trouble financially because the kind of hypersexual presentation in the models and through the products seem to not so successfully reflect the evolving ethos and taste around all of this. But I think for most of us, the iconic quality of Victoria's Secret as this secret sexuality that's moving under the surface of things.
And so the name is actually so evocative, right? Because Victoria, there's a whole kind of archetype there. And then the idea of a secret. So it's something about the secret pleasure of that which is repressed.
Absolutely.
I think we're in that territory.
And so when we're in the dream, she goes into this environment where beauty, sexuality, and the kind of enhancement through costume and clothing costs a lot. It's really expensive. So if we stay with that model of repression, that there's something about laying hold of perhaps some dimension of that eroticism or sexuality is going to cost something from the ego, or at least she fears that it will.
Right, that it's not worth that much. But other aspects of her psyche disagree and are clamoring. So this might be something the ego has devalued, but that some part of her does really want to lay hold of it.
And we definitely all have that experience of the unconscious blurting something out that the ego would not have wanted to be said, or accidentally taking an action that the unconscious wants, but the ego doesn't, which goes to that Ian McGilchrist stuff that we like to talk about so much of right brain and left brain. And in the documentary about his book, he shows these fascinating videos of people whose corpus callosum has been severed, which is that part of the brain that allows the right and left hand to dialogue. And he has this film about people trying to perform an activity or play a game, and the right and left hand warring against each other, because one side of the brain wants to do one thing, the other side of the brain wants to do something else. So we're in that realm that the unconscious has slipped some underwear into her bag. So we can imagine, in terms of the stealing impulse, perhaps the ego didn't want to be seen as wanting these items, somehow embarrassing to bring it up to the register and have another person handle it and put it into a bag.
Or that you want it, but you're not prepared to pay the price for it. And it's interesting because her task at the end is to return it, but she can't do it without getting in trouble. So she's going to have to sort of face the music or pay the piper or what, she's going to have to bear the cost of this thing, whatever this is, becoming conscious.
So there's getting in trouble for having taken it without providing the compensation. But I wonder if there's also a certain kind of trouble was going to happen in the psyche because she's giving it back and disavowing it.
Yep.
That the unconscious wants this or whatever it represents. And if the ego grabs it and pushes it back into a suppression or a repression, the unconscious is going to cause some trouble.
And so what do we imagine that it might be, or I'll do the thing you're never supposed to do and ask multiple questions in one go. What do we make of the other people in the dream? The fact that it goes from being something that's very positive and idealized to something that's frustrating and doesn't feel good. And the entrance of her father and this crowded bedroom. What else can we imagine about any of that?
Right, that the family complex inside of her is ambivalent about her sexuality being overt, or perhaps a certain kind of theatrical extension of the sexuality, which I think is part of costuming in sex play. And part of what's happened in the dream is she's accidentally stolen some things. She doesn't tell us how the rest of the family has become aware of this, whether they simply know because they're parts of the psyche, or whether the ego declared it because she's having so much trouble holding the anxiety about what's happening. And that makes me think of some things that children will do. If children have a secret, there's a way in which it's very hard for them to keep the secret because it creates so much tension and excitement inside of them. So they'll often blurt the secret out to the parents or someone else as a way of managing the tension inside. What's also interesting here is that her husband's not in that group.
So here's what I'm thinking. Two sentences that go together. I have no idea how it got into my bag, it being the underwear. The next sentence, my dad has arrived with some of my friends and my sister. So the underwear winds up in her bag and her dad arrives. The two things are related somehow. So the underwear arrives, the dad arrives. I don't know that I think this dreamer is wrong to say that the underwear in the dream may be linked to this information that she has about her dad. But I'm also guessing that it's more as well. That there might be some part of her own sexuality or some psychological dynamic that's a little bit split off and devalued, and that the unconscious wants to claim. And perhaps whatever that is finds a resonance in the father or in the father's situation. Somehow there's a kind of syntonic thing that happens between her and the dad in the dream. And there is a kind of lack of boundaries at the end. Everyone's cramped in this little room. Earlier, everyone was kind of all in the bed together. The dad arrives with her friends. There isn't a lot of differentiation. And it may be that the psychological stuff that is in the parents' marriage, I mean, just like there's not really good boundaries with mom kind of blurting out this stuff. But whatever the psychological stuff is that's in the marriage, I imagine it's kind of contaminated her psyche too, or found a resonance with it, that something's going on two levels here.
I think that makes perfect sense. And so the dad, the friends, the sister are all saying that you'd have to take it back, which is a way of bringing consciousness to something. And then it also sets up the possibility that it could be legitimately purchased.
Exactly. Yes.
So instead of it being a secret that causes a huge amount of anxiety, that one could go back, pay for it, make restitution, but then have a right to own it.
Yeah.
And whatever it represents.
Right.
And so she says that she has a lovely marriage and that they're just in their first year and it's going really well. So the dream is also not necessarily saying that something is wrong, but it could be forward-looking that, after the first year of marriage, there might be brewing in the unconscious a next step in terms of embracing a dimension of sexuality or eroticism or enhancement of one's erotic attractiveness. And the unconscious is curious about that, not because everything is wrong, but just because it might be more fun for that matter.
Because we spent so long talking about Victoria's Secret, I do wonder, so what is repressed here? What's repressed in her, and what might be repressed in the family? And perhaps they're similar.
Well, when I think about Victoria's Secret and, for instance, the catalogs that came out, there was such a shame-free demonstration of physical beauty and ways to enhance and adorn that beauty and sexuality. And so part of the movement could be going from feeling shameful to feeling shame-free, even proud of how one might look in that kind of a presentation. I'm thinking, Lisa, about the possibility of some kind of a parallel process, which I think you've intimated, between what's going on in the parental relationship and what's going on for her and her psyche. And the action in the dream is that she's, stolen this underwear, but she's also declared it to the father. And so there is perhaps a desire to have a conversation around sexuality and beauty and eroticization that the unconscious would like to trick her into having with dad and with the family.
Yeah.
And has kind of successfully done that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
In the room. So all of a sudden, it's out in the open.
Yeah.
We're talking about
her underwear.
Yeah, what's
very
underneath the propriety, as you were saying, of Victorian culture.
Right, because that's part of the pleasure of wearing fancy underwear, right? Is that most people in the room with you don't know you're wearing it.
Everyone tells me I have to take it back, which is also something people will say about language. Take that back, the thing you said, as if you could wind it out of the conversation. But what's been declared here is this kind of exuberant possibility around sexuality and eros. And the father or the sister and the friends are associated with the withdraw that, take that back.
Yeah.
So it's up to the dream ego. She doesn't know how to do this without getting into trouble, but she also still has to make a decision whether she wants to do it at all.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, that what she's left with at the end of the dream reminds me of the thing that happens in the sort of Psyche and Eros fairy tales, like Beauty and the Beast and other stories like that. It's like So Beauty's been living with the beast in the castle, and, by night he turns into a handsome prince, and it's like awesome, but it's private and it's secret, and you can't take it out into the rest of the world, and no one else can know about it. And so that thing that happens where she goes home and then, she doesn't come back in time, and the beast is going to die. It's this crisis turning point in the story where this thing that has been enjoyed in the unconscious only needs to be made conscious. And it feels a little, it's exactly what you were saying. Like, yeah, she could go back. So if this really happened, if you came home from the mall and there were little pink lacy underwear in your bag and you didn't know how you got there, you might go, God, shit, I've got to go back, sneak in and just take it out of my bag and leave it somewhere, and then no one will ever know I took it. Right? Or you could go back, as you were saying, Joseph, and say, okay, look, I accidentally left the store. I'd really like to pay for these. So, so there's, you can go on sneaking around and being unconscious and having the secret, or you could claim it consciously. And it's just not really clear where that's going to go for this dreamer.
So it brings up for me the distinction between secret versus celebration. So when I think of, if anyone's been in one of these stores, it is such a clear celebration of beauty and refinement and sexuality in a way that's open and declarative. And that was actually part of the fellow's imagining as he was setting up the store. So let's take this out of that uncomfortable kind of place and turn it into a celebration.
No more terry cloth robes.
Kind of Disney World of sexy underwear.
Yeah.
And have it out in the open, in the malls, have everybody see it in the display windows. This is what's going on here. And to reject the hiding energy that most of us feel, particularly in Western culture, about sexuality being so repressed. So she has a decision to make about what's okay being visible, what she chooses to keep hidden, and this appearance of sexuality for herself and for her family. And it also seems like the dream has not reached a lysis. So the lysis is the finishing scene of the dream drama. And that when a dream doesn't show a resolution, it really tells us that the unconscious is really grinding in the tension.
Yeah. This is like a Lady or the Tiger dream. I don't know if you remember that old short story where there's a lady behind one door and a tiger behind the other, and we don't know, that the story just ends. We don't know which one gets picked. This is one of those. It just drops us. The question has been posed. It has not been answered.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.